is no longer really an opportunity or choice, it's an imperative. To telling the story, how do we make sure that we're taking full advantage of any and all assets that are on the grid and at customer premises.
Welcome to the ei360 podcast. My name is Sandy Coughlin, and today I'm bringing you a captivating speech delivered from our founder, strategic advisor, and board member, David Swink. In this discussion, David will talk about the transformative power of convergence, actionable data, and I think he said making what is it. Take a listen and let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have a little extra time after that, we would love for you to go check out our new website. It's ei360.com. Our team has worked really hard to update it, make it a little bit more user-friendly, and we really think it's a great educational tool for anybody that's looking to, take that first step in the digital transformation. Let us know what you think about that too, and have a wonderful week. We'll see you next time.
I'm reminded of what Steve Jobs once said when he said that it's innovation that distinguishes leaders from followers. I spent 30 plus years in the energy sector before we started in exchange in 2019 as an energy company that really is looking at the transformation that's happening in our industry today. And I would like to share with you two key thoughts and 3 points that support those key thoughts. I don't have slides, so you're just going to have to listen to me. But I would tell you, the first key thought I would share with you is this, is that it's very important, I believe, that we are listening to the music that's taking place around us. Someone once said that for those who are dancing, it looks insane to those who can't hear the music. Have you ever seen somebody drive up next to you in a car and they're dancing and you're like, they must be crazy. But the reality is they hear the music and we don't. I was born in 1962. That was the year, if many of you remember the Jetsons, that was the year the Jetsons was launched as the cartoon. And so I grew up watching the Jetsons. Didn't realize it only really lasted 1 year. But that was cast in 1962 as these are technologies that we can expect to happen in the next 100 years, in 2062. Flash forward about 40 years, and most all of those technologies that were in the Jetsons we now have today. Basically robotic vacuums, smartphones, smart watches, flat screen TVs, flying drones, microwaves. But can you imagine, for those who, my era, who grew up in 1962, that looked crazy, that looked insane. How many of you said one time or another in your life, I wish I would have thought of that? And how many of us would have liked to have thought of one of those technologies that was cast in 1962. It is important that we hear the music. I remember my father saying when we were looking at watching a cartoon one day, he said, that'll never happen in a million years. Well, it didn't happen in 100 years, it happened in 40 years. And I would tell you, I really think we're living in exponential times. And I'm not sure sometimes I fully embrace that. But I'm excited about what's happening in the energy sector today. The 3 points I really would like to make as it relates to the energy sector is, first of all, and Mark, thank you for so eloquently touching on these 3 points. I think I wouldn't have to really even share much because you touched on these so well. And that first is convergence is creating exponential growth. Secondly, I'd like to share with you that I think knowing is everything, or it used to be. I think today it's not just a knowledge economy, it's an actionable data economy. It's no longer just about knowing, it's about actionable data that we live in, algorithms, machine learning, artificial intelligence. And I want to speak to that and what that means in the energy sector. And then thirdly, I think it's very important that we make what is it. And I'll share more with you what I mean by that in my last point. And then I'll share with you my last thought, which is really that of what is your late fees. And I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. But first of all, convergence is creating exponential growth. Mark touched on a number of these. I think there are the 3 Ds that are creating exponential growth and creating convergence in the energy sector. And I think it's so important that we understand these 3 Ds. Some talk about 5 Ds, but I will say 3 Ds. 1 is digitalization, 2 is decentralization, and 3 is decarbonization. Those 3 Ds are creating a convergence that's happening in our industry like we've never seen before in unprecedented times. Think about it for just a moment. Digitalization. By 2026, it's projected $148 billion will be spent in the IoT market. $148 billion. We all know that where money goes, that's normally where the attention goes. And so we're seeing a lot of money being spent in these areas. There's more devices and sensors today than there are people. You think about GE just said here recently that sensors and devices are going to grow like daisies. Just think about the amount of information that's going to come through these sensors and devices that we see across generation to toaster. Front of the meter, behind the meter. Secondly, the idea of decentralization. Think about decentralization, what's driving that. $110 billion by 2026 is going to be spent on decentralization. That means moving the generation near the load. Now, I spent a lot of time and years in the energy industry, that whole centralized approach of generation, transmission, distribution, down to the meter. I'm one that believes it's an exciting time to move the load near where, or the production where the load's at. Because I think there's a lot of losses that come from generation, transmission, distribution, substation, distribution areas. But we're seeing extensive growth in decentralization. And then thirdly, the decarbonization. We all know, no matter where you stand on that, it's happening. And this whole initiative, net zero by 2015, think about it. Many believe we're going to have to spend $50 trillion to actually achieve net zero by 2050. So those 3 Ds are very important. But what do they mean to the major components of generation to toaster? And I just want to touch on those for just a moment as well in this idea of convergence. But before I go there, think about for just a moment, how many of you have a cell phone? It's kind of a stupid question, right? I mean, all of us have a cell phone today. Nothing probably talks more extensively about convergence than what we have in our hands. I just read here, months ago, that what you and I have in our hands is worth $2,700 a year. You know, the old adage is we know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. Think about how many things are on your cell phone today that you used to have to pay for. The GPS system, a police scanner, phone itself, camera, books, music. All that is converged into this one platform. One of the things that in exchange I've always believed is, I spent all the time in the utility industry, is why can't we converge or have the ability to put in one single pane the ability to visualize all the data from generation to toaster, and how can we turn that into not just monitoring but controlling? And as Terry just said a moment ago, and I believe Terry's right on point, we're moving to control as a service. We're moving to microgrids as a service. We're moving toward DERMS, distributed energy resource management as a service. We're moving toward virtual power plants. The idea of actually converting buildings into prosumers versus just consumers. But let me break down the grid, distributed energy, smart buildings, and EV, and how those are converging as well. Think about the grid for just a moment. I know in 1994, we started doing smart grid. The utility I was managing in Missouri, about 60 miles from here, and we spent a significant amount of money making our grid smart. What we just thought we had it going on. And we're going to make our grid smarter. We're going to be able to manage our grid in very effective ways. And I would tell you, I believe it failed. I think smart grid, in large part, has failed. I think we're moving toward a time where we're not just, because most people who did smart grid were only using about 4% of the data. If we really want to make grids smart, we need to make grids where they're neural grids, where they're intuitive grids, where they're autonomous grids. And that's what we're seeing today. How many of you just seen here recently, just a few days ago, that $3.5 billion was released by DOE for grid resiliency? Jerry's raising his hand. I mean, this is game-changing money, unprecedented historical investment that's happening through this, what's called the GRIP program, Grid Resiliency Investment Program from DOE. Keep in mind, that's just matching dollars. That's just the first round of 3. So that's $7 billion that's going to flood into the utility industry, the energy sector, to transform this energy sector as we know it. Only 58 projects were funded. 700 projects were submitted to DOE. So that means 700 utilities out there have a vision of what we represent, of what we're talking about here in terms of making the grid smart, from being just a smart grid to a neural grid to an autonomous grid. Secondly, maybe let's talk about the convergence of not just the grid, but the convergence of distributed energy. Today, with what we're seeing in shutting down fossil fuels, no matter where you stand with that in terms of central station, and we're now beginning to see a lot of intermittent power that's been added to the grid, solar, wind. We're starting to see the ramifications of that. We're seeing where we don't have capacity in really hot times, really cold times. And so we're actually seeing rolling blackouts, things that we would have never seen in the past. And so now we're seeing an influx of grid resiliency, demands for grid resiliency at the edge of decentralization, whether that be battery, solar, microturbines, reciprocating engines. We're just seeing more and more generation at the edge because of the need for resiliency. But I also believe that the whole idea of decentralization or distributed energy is also driven by electrification. Again, Mark talked about this on the EV side, and I'll touch on that a little bit here in just a moment as we think about that convergence. But then smart buildings. I started my career doing energy audits with commercial buildings, and so I've always been both disappointed and fascinated by how much waste goes into what I would call the commercial building or commercial industrial loads, if you will. My understanding is commercial industrial loads use about 40% of the total energy in our country today, but 80% of the peak demand is driven by commercial industrial loads. $380 billion spent on energy in the energy industry or the commercial industrial loads. Just think about the amount of opportunity that lies in making those commercial customers a part of the energy equation. And not just a part of the energy equation, but being intermingled with distributed energy and autonomous grid and what that consists of. I also understand that there was a building here a year ago that went from, we were talking about megabytes per day to gigabytes per day, and now we're talking 100 terabytes on this one building in one day. 100 terabytes of information and data. Just imagine, if you would, the amount of data that we're talking about coming off of the smart building. Lastly is EV charging. Again, part of this convergence. EV charging today, my understanding, there's 132,000 EV chargers across the country. In order to go from 10% of the fleet, the light-duty fleet, to 50% of the light-duty fleet, it's my understanding we're going to have to grow level 2 charges to 2 million level 2 chargers and 172,000 level 3 chargers. But just fathom that for just a moment in terms of the power density that's going to be required to serve that type of EV charging. We're talking about level 2, somewhere between 25 to 50 kW, which 50 kW, a light, small commercial building, perhaps of 25 to 30,000 square foot. And when you talk about level 3, we're talking about anywhere from 150 to 300 kW. And we're talking about a lot of these convenience stores and truck stops where they're talking about putting 5, 6, 7 of them in. And we're going from loads that were one time 500 kW to megawatts and now perhaps 3, 4 megawatts out in the middle of nowhere. You see the convergence that potentially is going to go on between the grid, distributed energy, smart buildings, and EV. We need to be thinking about a system of systems. That's what our platform represents, a system of systems. A platform that's not just about an aggregation of data, but a platform that's about network orchestration, orchestrating all the assets as one system versus independent point solutions. Secondly, my second point would be this, is that knowing is everything, or it used to be. It's really about actionable data. I heard someone once make the statement, we don't know what we don't know. We can't act on what we don't know. We won't know what we don't search. We won't search what we don't question. We won't question what we don't measure. Hence, we just don't know. Now, I would tell you that I think for a leader, for somebody who's innovative, we need to be searching and questioning and measuring things today like we've never done before. I think it's important that we reject common thinking and start, if we're going to get uncommon results in our society today. I think it's important for us to understand as a group that 90%, and Terry talked about some of this, 90% of the data that's ever been created has been created in the last few years. But then the downside of that is only 80% of that data is structured data. Again, that's been a big emphasis of ours, is how do we take this data and create a structure of the data. We call that a nodal graph architecture, where we're able to go beyond relational data to where we're really able to create these data points as nodal structures, almost like the DNA that you and I have. That's what's really driving a lot of what we're seeing with generative AI in our society today. Mark pointed out a couple of things I just would touch on when I think about knowing. I think that he is right on about the fact that interoperability is the holy grail. It is so important today that as we think about convergence, that the convergence of these technologies are built on this idea of interoperability, where we can kind of create this plug-and-play experience. I mean, that's really what's happened with our cell phones, right? Is that ability to download an app and know immediately I can start using it. It becomes kind of a plug-and-play type of experience. And I believe that's where we're headed to with this, in the energy sector, is interoperability. My understanding is that it's costing the energy industry nearly somewhere between $150 billion plus a year because of non-interoperability assets. It is my understanding that $10 billion a year, let me restate that, $150 million a year. My understanding is that if we create an interoperable grid, it will drive up to $10 billion in efficiencies and in terms of value to our economy. So interoperability, in terms of knowing, I believe is very important. Secondly, I think that it's also important that we create the ability for visualization tools to be presented to people where they can see the data in real time and have the ability to experience the data in more of a less time to value. I mean, how many of us have put in smart technologies and it's been months and perhaps years before we really saw the data? So having dynamic data visualization tools is also very important, I believe, to this whole knowledge-based economy and knowing capability. The last thing that I would share with you, as I can see the timer's running out here, my third point being that to make that is. Someone once said that is, that is not, is that not it? I'll say that again, so in case you want to write it down. That is, that is not, is that not it? What is the it factor? And I think it's important. We're talking about a lot of technologies here today. We're talking about a lot of innovation here today. But I would advocate to you, I believe the biggest it factor for us, for any company today, is to cultivate big picture thinking. Terry shared the book on the third wave, and I agree wholeheartedly that we got to be thinking about where we're at today and how do we cultivate that big picture thinking in our companies today. I don't think success today is measured by our revenues, our margins, the things that we have technologically. I do believe that our success is measured by the ability for us to think big, to think outside the box. Think about those people who wrote the Jetsons, how big picture thinking they had. And I would share with you a scenario that I think all of us are very familiar with, kind of in closing, and it's that last thought: what is your late fees? In mid-1990s, how many of you were very familiar with Blockbuster and Netflix scenario? Many of you read those stories about Blockbuster and Netflix. We're all very familiar with what happened there. We're familiar with the fact that Blockbuster at one point was an $8.2 billion valuation. At one point when Netflix came to Blockbuster and said, hey, would you like to buy our company, they had a $50 million valuation. My understanding is Blockbuster pretty much laughed at him and said, we don't see this as the future, so you move on. At one point, Blockbuster had 9,000 stores. Today, from my understanding, is they have one store in Bend, Oregon, and from my understanding, is the only reason they have that store is because now it's kind of a tourist destination. In other words, people like to go there because it's kind of history. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's what we want to be, is a tourist destination, because we didn't make good decisions. But what's interesting to me is you read that story about Blockbuster and Netflix. I did not realize it, but many believe that the major component or aspect that changed everything was the fact that people didn't like the late fees. And Netflix was able to remove the late fees. And so that it wasn't necessarily the technology, it was the late fees. And Blockbuster believed that they could charge late fees because they had a captive audience. They believed that, you're a captive audience, almost like a monopoly. Now, I don't know how many of you have been in the energy industry. I grew up in it. And one of the things that I really don't like about it is the monopolistic viewpoint and standpoint. That's just me. I believe that empowering people, empowering customers, is a real value to a business. And I believe the late fees in the utility industry today is build as much as you want to build, because you got a captive audience, I'll charge you whatever rates I want to charge you. Those days are gone. I believe those days are gone. And I believe there's an opportunity today to transform the utility industry because of that mentality of late fees. And so my question to all of us is, what are our late fees? What do we believe in that will not change? What do we believe in that we have as a captive capability? Because I believe that's our biggest risk. We got to understand that technology is going to change everything. Convergence is going to change everything. The knowledge economy is going to change everything. Those who have the ability to think big and think the capacity of the technology are those who are going to win the day. Thank you.